The invitation to my daughter-in-law Sophia's dinner party came with very specific instructions about my role for the evening. "Helen, I need you to help serve dinner on Saturday night," she said, not looking up from her laptop where she was planning the menu. "Nothing fancy, just clearing plates, refilling wine glasses, that sort of thing." I'd been living with my son Marcus and Sophia for 3 months, ever since my mild stroke had left me with some balance issues that made living alone in my 2-story house temporarily unsafe. The recovery was going well, but my doctors wanted me to have family support while I regained full stability. "Of course, dear. Who are you entertaining?" "Some people from my work. The regional director is coming, along with a few other executives. It's really important for my career advancement." Sophia worked as a marketing coordinator at Meridian Financial Group, a mid-sized investment firm where she'd been trying to get promoted to senior management for the past 2 years. These dinner parties were her way of networking with the decision-makers who controlled her professional future. "I'd be happy to help with the cooking too," I offered. "Thanks, but I've already hired a caterer. I just need you to assist with serving and cleanup." What struck me as odd was that she framed my help as necessary rather than appreciated. Not "would you mind helping," but "I need you to help," as if my assistance was an obligation rather than a choice. But I attributed it to pre-party stress and agreed to help however she needed. What Sophia didn't know, what I'd never told Marcus or her, was that my mild stroke had been discovered during routine medical tests related to my work as an anonymous angel investor. For the past 15 years, I'd been quietly building a portfolio of investments in small and medium-sized companies, often taking majority or significant minority stakes in businesses that showed promise. Meridian Financial Group was one of those investments. 3 years ago, when they were struggling with cash flow and facing potential bankruptcy, I'd stepped in as a silent partner, purchasing a 60% ownership stake that had allowed them to restructure, expand, and become profitable. The investment had been managed through shell companies and legal structures that kept my identity private. To the employees and management of Meridian, their majority shareholder was simply HC Enterprises, a name that revealed nothing about the 72-year-old woman recovering from a stroke in their marketing coordinator's garage. I lived modestly by choice, not necessity. The small pension and social security checks that Marcus and Sophia saw were just a fraction of my income. My real wealth came from dividends, capital gains, and the quarterly reports that showed my investment portfolio's steady growth. But I'd always believed that money was a tool, not an identity. I preferred to see how people treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer except my presence and my love. Saturday afternoon arrived with Sophia in full hostess mode, directing the caterers, arranging flowers, and making final preparations for what she clearly hoped would be a career-defining evening. "Helen, I need to ask you a favor," she said as I was getting dressed for the dinner. "What's that?" "I need you to dress appropriately for your role tonight." "My role?" "As the serving help. I don't want my guests to be confused about who you are." I looked down at the simple but nice dress I'd chosen, nothing fancy, but clean and presentable. "Is there something wrong with what I'm wearing?" "It's too nice. You look like a guest rather than someone who's working. Could you maybe wear something more service appropriate?" Service appropriate. She wanted me to dress like hired help rather than family. "Sophia, I'm your mother-in-law helping with your party, not a hired server." "I know that, but my guests don't need to know the family dynamics. It's simpler if they think you're professional staff." "You want me to pretend to be hired help?" "I want you to be discreet about your role so my guests can focus on business conversations without worrying about family politeness." The request was bizarre and hurtful, but I could see the stress in Sophia's face. This party was clearly important to her, and she was worried about making the right impression. "Fine. I'll change into something more casual." When the guests arrived at 7, I was dressed in dark slacks and a plain white blouse, an outfit that Sophia had approved as appropriately service-oriented. I helped serve appetizers and refill drinks while Sophia played the role of the sophisticated hostess. The guests were exactly what I expected from a financial services company, well-dressed, professionally polished, and clearly impressed by Sophia's beautiful home and elegant presentation. "Sophia, your house is stunning," said Janet Morrison, the regional director whose approval Sophia was desperately seeking. "You have excellent taste." "Thank you, Janet." Marcus and I believe that creating a beautiful environment reflects our attention to detail and quality. As I circulated with wine glasses, I listened to the conversations about market trends, client relationships, and office politics. These were my employees, people whose salaries I ultimately funded, whose jobs I'd helped save when the company was struggling, whose bonuses came from profits generated by investments I'd approved. But they saw me as invisible hired help, someone whose presence was utilitarian rather than social. The wine selection is exceptional, commented David Chen, the head of client relations. Where did you source these bottles? Helen has an excellent palate for wine, Sophia said, gesturing toward me with casual dismissiveness. She helped with the selection. David nodded politely in my direction, the way one acknowledges a helpful service provider, then continued his conversation with Sophia about business strategy. Throughout dinner, I served courses and cleared plates while the guests discussed Meridian's future plans, expansion strategies, and personnel decisions. They talked openly about company finances, client acquisitions, and competitive positioning, information that, as the majority shareholder, I found quite interesting. We're looking at acquiring 2 smaller firms next quarter, Janet told the table. The financing is already approved, and we should see significant growth in our client base. This was news to me. As the majority shareholder, major acquisitions required my approval, yet no one had contacted HC Enterprises about any pending deals. What kind of financing structure? Asked Marcus, trying to participate in the business conversation. Traditional bank loans plus some private investor backing. Our anonymous majority shareholder has been very supportive of expansion initiatives. Anonymous majority shareholder. They were talking about me while I stood 3 feet away, refilling their water glasses. It must be nice to have investor backing, Sophia said. So many companies struggle with cash flow. We're very fortunate, Janet agreed. Our majority partner has been hands-off but incredibly generous with capital investment. They seem to trust our management completely. As the evening progressed, Sophia became increasingly comfortable treating me like hired staff rather than family. She snapped her fingers to get my attention, spoke to me in the short, directive sentences people use with service providers, and at one point corrected me in front of guests for not clearing plates quickly enough. Helen, we need the dessert course started, she said with the tone of a manager addressing an employee. Of course, I replied calmly, continuing to smile and serve as if nothing unusual was happening. But the most shocking moment came after dinner, when the guests were ready to leave and Janet Morrison complimented Sophia on her excellent household management. Thank you, Sophia replied. It helps that our live-in domestic is so reliable. Live-in domestic. She was describing me, her mother-in-law, Marcus's mother, a woman recovering from a stroke, as domestic help. Where does she stay? David asked. Finding good live-in help can be challenging. Oh, Helen stays in the garage apartment. It's perfect for her, close enough to be available when needed, but separate enough to give us family privacy. The guests found this arrangement perfectly reasonable, nodding approvingly at Sophia's clever solution to the help problem. But I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Garage apartment? I was sleeping in the guest bedroom, not the garage. Sophia, Janet said, you'll have to give me the contact information for your domestic agency. Finding quality household staff is so difficult these days. Helen isn't from an agency, Sophia replied smoothly. She's more like family help, very loyal, very reliable. Family help. She'd reduced my relationship to Marcus and my role in their home to that of unpaid domestic labor. As the guests left, they thanked Sophia effusively for the wonderful evening while completely ignoring my presence, as if I'd been invisible throughout the night. After everyone was gone, Sophia was practically glowing with satisfaction. That went perfectly, she told Marcus. Janet was so impressed with how smoothly everything ran. Mom worked really hard tonight, Marcus said, finally acknowledging my contribution. Oh yes, Helen was very helpful, Sophia agreed. Though next time, I think we should set up the serving station more efficiently. Next time. She was already planning to use me as unpaid help for future career networking events. Sophia, I said carefully, earlier you mentioned that I stay in a garage apartment. I sleep in your guest bedroom. Well, yes, technically. But telling people you live in our guest room makes it sound like you're a long-term house guest rather than someone who helps with household management. I am a long-term house guest. I'm Marcus's mother, recovering from a stroke. I know that. But tonight was about creating the right impression for my career. Having a domestic shows success and sophistication in ways that having your mother-in-law living with you doesn't. The conversation was so bizarre that I wasn't sure how to respond. Sophia had turned my medical recovery into her domestic help narrative, and she seemed genuinely pleased with how cleverly she'd managed the situation. Did it occur to you that I might be uncomfortable being described as hired help? Helen, you weren't hired help. You were family help. There's a difference. What difference? Hired help gets paid. Family help is just family. I went to bed that night thinking about identity, perception, and the ways that people reveal their character when they think their actions don't have consequences. Sophia had spent the evening treating me like invisible domestic labor while networking with executives whose salaries I ultimately controlled. She described me as garage help to impress people who worked for a company I owned. But most revealing was her assumption that family relationships gave her the right to exploit my labor and misrepresent my role without my consent. What she didn't realize was that her anonymous majority shareholder had just observed an evening of strategic planning discussions, personnel insights, and character assessments that would be very interesting to review with company management. Monday morning, I had some phone calls to make. Monday morning, I called my investment manager, Patricia Wang, who handled the day-to-day operations of my business portfolio. Patricia, I need to schedule a meeting with the management team at Meridian Financial Group. Is there a problem with the investment? There's a problem with personnel that needs immediate attention. What kind of personnel problem? I have concerns about an employee's professional judgment and ethical standards that could impact the company's reputation and client relationships. Which employee? Sophia Martinez in the marketing department. I need a full review of her performance, her role in client-facing activities, and her potential for advancement. Patricia was surprised. Helen, you usually stay completely hands-off with personnel decisions. What's prompted this level of concern? I've received information that suggests this employee may not have the judgment or integrity required for senior management positions. What kind of information? The kind that makes me question whether she should represent our company to clients and partners. We scheduled a meeting for Wednesday afternoon with Janet Morrison and the senior management team. I would be attending as HC Enterprises representative, finally revealing my identity to the people who had been managing my investment for 3 years. Tuesday morning, Sophia was still glowing from her successful dinner party. Helen, I've been thinking about Saturday night, she said over breakfast. You were so helpful that I'd like to make this a regular arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I want to host monthly networking dinners, and having reliable domestic help would make such a difference for my career advancement. Domestic help. Family domestic help, she corrected, as if that made the exploitation more palatable. It would benefit everyone. I get career advancement, which benefits Marcus financially, and you get to feel useful during your recovery. Sophia, I'm not your domestic help. I'm your mother-in-law who helped with one dinner party. But you're so good at it. And it's not like you have other obligations while you're recovering. My recovery doesn't make me available for unpaid labor. It's not unpaid labor, it's family contribution. Everyone should contribute to the household's success. The conversation was surreal. Sophia genuinely seemed to believe that my stroke recovery had transformed me into their household staff, available for her career networking events. What did you tell your guests about my living situation? I told them the truth, that you live in our garage area and help with household management. I don't live in the garage, Sophia. I live in your guest bedroom. Same difference. The point is that you're available to help when needed. And you told them I was domestic help rather than family. I told them you were family help, which is basically the same thing. That afternoon, while Sophia was at work networking with the same executives I would be meeting tomorrow, I prepared for the most important business meeting of my investment career. Wednesday arrived with Sophia practically bouncing with excitement about her latest career development. Helen, Janet Morrison wants to have lunch with me today to discuss my potential for promotion. Saturday's dinner party was apparently exactly the kind of sophistication they want to see in senior management. That's wonderful, dear. She was so impressed with how smoothly everything ran. Having reliable domestic support really made the difference. As Sophia left for her potentially career-making lunch with Janet Morrison, I left for my meeting with the same woman, a meeting that would reveal exactly who had been funding Janet's salary for the past 3 years. The Meridian Financial Group offices were impressive, modern, professional, and clearly successful. As I walked through the lobby toward the executive conference room, I passed Sophia's workstation, where she kept a small framed photo of her and Marcus from their wedding. Patricia Wang met me in the lobby. "Helen, are you ready for this? Once you reveal your identity, there's no going back to being an anonymous investor." "I'm ready. The situation has evolved beyond what I can handle from a distance." "And you're certain about your concerns regarding Sophia Martinez?" "I'm certain that her judgment and character make her unsuitable for senior management positions." We entered the conference room where Janet Morrison, David Chen, and 2 other senior executives were waiting. They'd been told only that HC Enterprises principal was finally ready to meet in person to discuss some personnel concerns. "Ms. Morrison," Patricia began, "I'd like you to meet Helen Carter, the principal behind HC Enterprises and your majority shareholder." The silence that followed was absolute. Janet stared at me with growing recognition and horror as she realized that the domestic help from Saturday's dinner was actually her boss's boss. "Mrs. Carter," Janet finally managed, "we had no idea." "That was intentional," I replied calmly. "I prefer to observe how companies operate when they think no one is watching." David Chen looked like he might be sick. "Mrs. Carter, if we'd known you were attending Saturday's dinner, you would have treated me differently. Which is exactly why I didn't tell you." I pulled out my notes from Saturday evening. I found the evening quite educational. I learned about your acquisition plans that apparently don't require majority shareholder approval. I learned about your expansion strategies that I haven't been consulted on. And I learned about your personnel assessment methods. "Mrs. Carter, we can explain. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of Sophia Martinez's potential for senior management." Janet's face went white. We haven't made any formal decisions. But you were impressed with her sophistication and household management skills." Yes, her dinner party was very well organized." "And you found her domestic arrangements appropriate for someone representing your company?" "I'm not sure I understand the question." I smiled. "Ms. Morrison, on Saturday evening, you observed Sophia Martinez treating her mother-in-law as unpaid domestic labor. You watched her lie about my living situation, misrepresent my role in her household, and exploit my stroke recovery for her social advancement. We didn't realize." "You didn't realize that the woman serving your wine was family rather than hired help? You didn't notice that she was treating a stroke victim as invisible domestic staff?" David Chen spoke up. "Mrs. Carter, we had no idea about the family relationship. Because Ms. Martinez deliberately misrepresented it. She told you I was garage help and domestic staff, rather than her husband's mother recovering from a medical emergency." Janet Morrison looked devastated. "Mrs. Carter, if we had known. If you had known I was your majority shareholder, you would have treated me with respect. But you saw no problem with an employee who exploits vulnerable family members for social advancement." "We never saw it that way." "How did you see it?" "We saw an employee who managed her household efficiently and presented herself professionally. You saw an employee who lied about her family relationships, exploited unpaid labor, and treated a stroke victim as invisible help. And you were impressed by this behavior." The room fell silent as the executives processed the full scope of what had happened. "Mrs. Carter," Janet said carefully, "what does this mean for Ms. Martinez's employment?" "That depends entirely on what kind of company you want to run. Do you want to promote employees who exploit vulnerable family members? Do you want senior managers who lie about their personal relationships for social advantage?" "No. Then I suggest you reconsider your assessment of Ms. Martinez's character and suitability for advancement." Patricia Wang pulled out the formal documentation. "Mrs. Carter has prepared some recommendations for personnel policy changes and management oversight improvements. For the next hour, We discussed how the company would handle employee ethics evaluations, family exploitation policies, and senior management character assessments. I made it clear that any employee who treated vulnerable people as disposable help was not suitable for representing a company I owned. As the meeting ended, Janet Morrison looked like she'd aged 10 years. "Mrs. Carter, what should we tell Ms. Martinez about this meeting?" "Tell her that her character assessment has been completed, and the results were not favorable for advancement. And if she asks about details, tell her that exploiting stroke victims for dinner party help is not consistent with the company's values." I left the office knowing that Sophia's career advancement dreams had just collided with the reality of her character choices. Her networking lunch with Janet Morrison was probably not going the way she'd expected. That evening, Sophia came home from work looking confused and shaken. "Helen, something strange happened today." "What's that?" My lunch with Janet Morrison was weird. She seemed uncomfortable and kept asking me about my family relationships and household management. That does sound strange. And then this afternoon, she called me into her office and said that my recent performance review had raised some concerns about my judgment and professional ethics. What kind of concerns? She wouldn't be specific. But she said that someone had questioned my suitability for senior management positions based on recent observations of my behavior. Marcus looked up from his dinner. "What kind of behavior?" "I have no idea. I've been nothing but professional at work. The only thing I can think of is Saturday's dinner party, but that went perfectly." "Did it?" I asked quietly. Of course it did. Everyone was impressed with how sophisticated and well-organized everything was. "And how did you describe my role to your guests?" "I told them you were family help who assisted with household management." "That's true, isn't it?" "Is it?" Sophia looked confused. "Helen, what's going on? You're acting like I did something wrong, but all I did was host a successful dinner party with your help." "Sophia, you told your guests that I was domestic help who lived in your garage." "I said you were family help who stayed in the garage area. It's not the same thing." "To your guests, it was exactly the same thing. They saw you treating your stroke-recovering mother-in-law as invisible hired help." "But that's not how I meant it." "How you meant it and how it appeared are two different things." And apparently, someone who matters professionally was not impressed with what they observed. As Sophia spent the evening trying to figure out who could have sabotaged her career advancement, I reflected on the distance between perception and reality, between how we see ourselves and how others see us. Tomorrow, she would learn that the someone who matters professionally was the woman she'd introduced as garage-dwelling domestic help. But tonight, she was simply a woman whose character had been assessed and found wanting by people who had observed her true behavior when she thought no one important was watching. 2 weeks after the disastrous management meeting, Sophia's career situation had deteriorated rapidly. She'd been passed over for the promotion she'd been expecting, placed on a performance improvement plan, and assigned to junior-level projects that felt like professional exile. "I don't understand what happened," she complained to Marcus over dinner. "Everything was going so well, and then suddenly Janet Morrison started treating me like I'm radioactive." "Did you ask her what changed?" "I tried, but she just keeps talking about character concerns and professional judgment issues. It's like someone convinced her that I'm a terrible employee overnight." Marcus looked at me. "Mom, you've been quiet about this whole situation. Do you have any insights?" I set down my fork carefully. "Sophia, what would you say if I told you that your networking dinner was observed by someone whose opinion matters more than Janet Morrison's?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone with significant influence over Meridian Financial Group was present Saturday night and was not impressed with what they saw." "That's impossible. I know everyone who was there." "Do you? Or do you know everyone who was there as a guest?" Sophia stared at me, confusion growing in her eyes. "Helen, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the majority shareholder of Meridian Financial Group." "What about them?" "They were present Saturday night. They observed your entire performance." "How could you possibly know that?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the HC Enterprises corporate documents that Patricia had prepared. "Because I am the majority shareholder, Sophia. I own 60% of your company." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. That's impossible, Sophia whispered. I've been your company's primary investor for 3 years. I saved Meridian from bankruptcy and have been funding your expansion ever since. Marcus stared at the documents. Mom, you own Sophia's company. I own the majority stake, yes. Sophia's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, shock, and finally, dawning horror as she realized the implications. You were there Saturday night. You were serving wine. You were. I was the domestic help you described to your guests as garage-dwelling family staff. Oh my God. I was the stroke victim you treated as invisible labor while networking with executives whose salaries I ultimately pay. Sophia started crying. Helen, I didn't know. I never would have. You never would have what, Sophia? Treated me badly if you'd known I had power? Exploited my vulnerability if you'd known there might be consequences? I wasn't exploiting you. I was just. You were just using your recovering mother-in-law as unpaid domestic help while lying to your professional contacts about my role and living situation. Marcus looked devastated. Sophia, you told people Mom lived in our garage. I said she stayed in the garage area. I was trying to make the household sound more professional. By describing my mother as your live-in domestic staff. It wasn't like that. I pulled out my notebook from Saturday evening. Sophia, let me read you some direct quotes from your performance that night. Her face went white. You took notes. Helen stays in the garage apartment, close enough to be available when needed, but separate enough to give us family privacy. I was just explaining. Our live-in domestic is so reliable. I didn't mean. Helen isn't from an agency, she's more like family help. Very loyal, very reliable. Each quote hit Sophia like a physical blow as she realized exactly what she'd said and how it had sounded to people who could control her career. Helen, I'm sorry. I was just trying to impress my colleagues. By misrepresenting your family relationships and exploiting my medical recovery. I wasn't thinking about how it would sound. You weren't thinking about how I would feel, either. Marcus was reading through the corporate documents. Mom, this says you've invested over $2 million in Meridian. That's correct. And Sophia's been working for you this whole time without knowing it. For 3 years, yes. Sophia looked up through her tears. What happens now? Are you going to fire me? I don't fire employees, Sophia. I make investment decisions based on the quality of management and staff. What does that mean? It means that your career at Meridian will depend entirely on your ability to demonstrate the character and judgment required for the positions you want. But I can change. I can be better. Can you? Because what I observed Saturday wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a systematic pattern of exploitation, deception, and cruelty toward someone you thought was powerless to object. Marcus spoke up. Mom, what specifically concerned you about Sophia's behavior? She lied to professional contacts about my living situation. She exploited my stroke recovery for unpaid labor. She treated me as invisible help while I served people whose salaries I fund. And she showed no awareness that any of this was inappropriate. But I apologized. You apologized after you learned I had power. Where was your concern for my feelings when you thought I was just your dependent mother-in-law? Sophia had no answer for that. Over the next hour, I explained to both of them how my investment business worked, why I preferred to remain anonymous, and how Saturday's dinner had revealed character issues that made me question Sophia's suitability for advancement. What would it take for me to rebuild your trust? Sophia asked. Sophia, this isn't about rebuilding my trust. This is about whether you understand why your behavior was wrong. I understand that I hurt your feelings. Do you understand that you exploited a vulnerable family member for social advancement? Yes. Do you understand that you lied to professional contacts about our family relationships? Yes. Do you understand that you treated a stroke victim as disposable domestic help? Sophia started crying again. Yes, I understand all of that. And what have you learned from understanding it? I've learned that I need to treat you with more respect. Why? Because you're family. Is that the only reason? Sophia looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, should you treat vulnerable people with respect only if they are family? Should you exploit people only if they are not related to you? No, of course not. Then what's the principle you've learned? Sophia thought carefully. I've learned that I shouldn't exploit anyone's vulnerability for my own advantage, regardless of their relationship to me. And I've learned that treating people as invisible or disposable is wrong, even if I think they can't fight back. What else? I've learned that my career advancement should come from my professional abilities, not from creating false impressions about my household management. It was a good answer, but I had one more question. Sophia, if I weren't your majority shareholder, if I were just another stroke victim with no power to affect your career, would you have learned these same lessons? She was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Probably not. Why not? Because I probably would have convinced myself that I hadn't done anything seriously wrong, since there weren't any consequences. And what does that tell you about your character? It tells me that I need to develop better ethical standards that don't depend on whether someone can retaliate against me. 6 months later, Sophia was still employed at Meridian, but in a lateral position that focused on her actual professional skills rather than her potential for senior management. She'd completed ethics training, enrolled in a course on elder care sensitivity, and had begun volunteering at a local stroke recovery center. More importantly, she'd started treating me like family rather than like help. Helen, she said one evening as we prepared dinner together, I know I can never fully make up for how I treated you that night. What have you learned from the experience? I've learned that character isn't what you do when people are watching, it's what you do when you think no one who matters is watching. And I've learned that everyone matters, whether they have power or not. Treating vulnerable people badly doesn't become acceptable just because they can't fight back. What will you do differently in the future? I'll remember that how I treat powerless people reveals who I really am. I'll remember that family love means protection, not exploitation. And I'll remember that career advancement built on deception and cruelty isn't worth having. A year after the garage incident, Sophia had developed into a genuinely ethical employee who was respected for her integrity rather than her networking skills. She never achieved the senior management position she'd originally wanted, but she'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that her worth as a person didn't depend on her professional status. As for me, I'd learned that remaining anonymous as an investor had value beyond privacy. It allowed me to see people's true character when they thought their actions wouldn't have consequences. The garage apartment Sophia had described never existed, but the lesson it taught was real, that treating vulnerable people as disposable help reveals everything about your character and nothing about theirs. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in teaching people the difference between power and character, between advancement and integrity. And sometimes the most expensive career mistake you can make is assuming that the powerless person serving your wine doesn't have the power to serve you justice.